Okay, so now 1, 2, 3, we can start. Hi, Jeanie. Thanks for joining us today for our discussion on embedding safeguarding into operations into the early learning sector. Before we get started, can you tell us about your firm, Safeguarding Solutions Australia?
Sure. Thank you for having me, Paula. So I've worked in the sector for many, many years, coming from child protection, career public servant, and was doing some pro bono work in Indonesia around safeguarding of vulnerable people, including children and young people. And at the time of the Royal Commission here in Australia, I started to want to invest more because of my own lived experiences within safeguarding in Australia. So out of that came Safeguarding Solutions Australia in 2018. And after having a career working so closely with regulators, it was a real seamless kind of transition out of public service into safeguarding consulting. And I suppose where we operate mostly is working with organisations who have strong regulatory obligations, such as early learning, where you've got lots of intersections between different regulatory standards and how those regulatory obligations actually intersect with each other. And it creates this whole degree of complexity, thinking that things need to be new and different when in fact they actually do work together really well when we understand our context. So Safeguarding Solutions really focuses a lot on supporting organisations in identifying, improving and managing their organisational and operational obligations. And we heavily focus on a pillar of practice that includes two pillars. And my colleague, who can't be with us today, she operates in one of those pillars, which is corporate compliance and clinical governance. And then our secondary pillar is the pillar of practice, which is where we start bringing those points together between the policy writers in the office that don't work directly in the front line and the voices of the people on the front line that drive the business and how they actually talk to each other. And I think that's been the thing that we've noticed the most to be the biggest challenge is we can figure out what we need to do, and Safeguarding Solutions heavily focuses on how that needs to be executed to work for everyone to get the best outcome for children.
Right. So can you walk us through what that means for early education? How do we operationalise safeguarding?
Yeah, so it's a big question.
Very big question.
Very big question. And I think if I put it really simply, we look at it as a desktop as compliance. So we think about, we need to have this policy, we need to have this code of conduct, we need to have this commitment statement, we need to have an investigation procedure, etc. And it's very easy to write a policy and it's very easy to write a procedure. The issue is embedding and implementing that procedure and ensuring that it talks to all the people that it has to work for and work with. So in terms of early learning, what we've noticed is two things. So the first thing I'd say is that it's really important to remember that familiarity breeds contempt. And the more familiar we become with a system or a process, the more desensitized we become to the risks that form part of it. And when we're heavily invested, we're emotional beings, right? So we don't want to see that something's wrong or that we're not doing things necessarily the right way. So what we do is look at the intersections between safeguarding and other regulatory responsibilities, such as the Occupational Health and Safety Act, for an example. And we talk to organisations about simplifying safeguarding, not making it bigger than it needs to be. And this is not at all for those who are working in a different safeguarding deliverable in terms of how they embed. We're not suggesting to minimise safeguarding. What we're actually doing is doing what the regulators are wanting, and that is embedding safeguarding into practice. And that's more than a piece of paper. That's about how do we execute the how and give people the resources, the tools and the skills to make sure that culturally we're creating an organisation of safety, and not just safety in terms of the traditional sense, but psychological safety. If we don't have psychological safety at the forefront, then we're not going to get the true experiences of staff, of consumers, of children, because we're not creating the environment for it. So basically what I'm saying there is that safeguarding is not a policy suite. Safeguarding is a transformational cultural change that has to happen over time. And the only way to be successful in that is to capture the voices of the people that have to experience it and execute the deliverable.
So, in saying that, what problem does it solve for approved providers if they do this, if they get it embedded and the process around that?
Yeah, so the benefit is huge, because when we think about regulatory standards, we often look at them individually. Um, I suppose the point of difference for us is that we look at the whole regulatory landscape of the organisation and think about what are the intersections, what are the things that are the same, what are the things that are similar but require a little bit of bespoke tweaking. And what this does in terms of problem solving is reduces your overall risk and your overall risk of liability, which therefore decreases your cost, which increases staff value and performance, and most importantly, increases, I suppose, or decreases the impact of any risk to children and young people. For us, that's our priority and our focus. Um, I'll just share at this point of the context behind my investment is that I am a survivor of institutional abuse myself. So when I look at this with the lens of this can't solve one problem. Safeguarding on its own is not going to reduce the risk to children. It'll solve a problem in terms of your safer recruitment strategies. So it's going to support HR, it's going to support risk, it's going to support your finance, risk and audit committees make sound decisions. It's going to reduce the likelihood of people gaining access to your organisation if you implement a safeguarding strategy successfully whilst understanding your broader demographic. If you try and do this as something that's separate and outside of, this requires a bespoke and to a degree it does, but when you start separating it completely, you're almost recreating the wheel because a lot of your internal service systems actually exist to support this, and it won't feel as jarring for your workforce. And I suppose the other thing is everybody would be very familiar, particularly in early childhood, of demand. There
Yes.
aren't enough hours in the day. So we want to make things work smarter, not harder. And that's including your systems, processes, policies that make the roles of educators easier, and they can actually focus on doing the job that they want to be there to do, and that is to educate, support, and grow little minds all over the world to create the next generation of amazing people.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that you are a survivor of abuse with us, Jeanie. That's a very, personal topic. Um, Obviously, statistically, it shows that the number is out there. You're certainly not alone in that.
Mm.
And we would have staff in the early learning sector who have also come through those years of abuse. The support that safeguarding or the embedding of safeguarding operationally, that would also make a big impact on those staff.
Absolutely, and when we think, that's why I raised the point of psychological safety. When we're having to embed a regulatory standard such as safeguarding within organisations in early childhood, what we have to think about is who are we tasking with the role and the execution of responsibilities to do that work. And if you're getting avoidance or reluctance in order to engage in this project, I think we need to look beyond. We need to look at, we only know this much of a person's life. And when we work with people, we think we know everything about them. But being a survivor is something that people hold near and dear to their hearts, because for fear of what people might say, how people might judge them, perceive them, etc. For me, it was a really important thing to turn my own pain into something meaningful and purposeful for other people to reduce risk. That's taken a very long time. And I think organisations, when they're thinking about culture, safeguarding is about cultural change. And cultural change is about knowing who your people are, knowing what drives them, knowing what values they hold and how do they align with your organisational values, and also giving people an opportunity through creating a safe, a psychologically safe environment to be able to say, this isn't something for me that I'm able to do at this point in time. Is there anybody else that can support me while I do this, without having to necessarily disclose their histories? And
Yes.
this is where organisations need to be more sophisticated when we think about the intersection to OH&S in this space and creating psychologically safe environments for staff. there's a perfect intersect of those two things. One regulation could actually create an absence of safety in another, because we're asking people to do something they're not comfortable with, but we haven't yet explored whether or not they are comfortable or not. So we need to know where we've been to know where we're going, and often that's the bit that gets missed. We just start diving in too quickly.
Yes, we go feet first.
100%.
Yeah. So with that, and moving on from that, and as you know, we preparation for this episode, we talked about the pain, frustration of taking the policy to operations. Can we delve into that a little bit? I know we just started talking about that.
Yeah.
So the complexities and the confusion, and also not that I can't imagine there would be anyone unwilling to do this. It's just the like you said, the feet first approach, and bringing that back, and everyone's thinking that they're doing the right thing or trying their best, when in fact, like you said, it's actually making holes in other places. So,
Absolutely.
so let's talk about how we can, look at that frustration.
Yeah.
And
So the complexity, I think, comes from, we've operated in a culture organisationally for a really long time of reaction. So we don't do something until something goes wrong and tells us that we should do something about it. And then when we think about the confusion and complexities associated to safeguarding, is that we're looking at risk in a very different way. So you've got your traditional ISO methodologies associated to enterprise risk and how we assess risk on the basis of consequence and likelihood. And then we've got the risk to persons, the individual themselves. And in this situation, from an early learning perspective, we'll look at the most vulnerable person in this space, which is the child themselves. And so when we think about enterprise risk and we think about human-centered risk, the two risk methodologies actually look quite different. So it's forcing people to look at risk in a different way. And I can still remember sitting in a room with a regulator and a risk specialist from an organisation, and the risk person saying, but look at the risk assessment that we've done says that this is a low risk. And they said, we appreciate that. But the consequences of that risk and the impact of that risk on this little person, if it was to occur, would be catastrophic. So one incident of abuse or harm is too many incidences. And when we think about that on the impact scale to a human being, particularly a child, one incident of harm that is considered low risk on your traditional scale actually compromises the safety and stability for that person for the rest of their lives. And I think we need to get comfortable with the uncomfortable of having these open conversations to say, this one incident could result in this person's death. It may not be today, but in 20 years' time, when they have to, come to the reality when they decide to have their own children, or, they smell a particular smell, that this never goes away for them. And this is where I think the regulator associated to child safety and safeguarding more broadly, both nationally and internationally, is actually shining a light on the value of the person rather than the business, which has been a huge change. What I would also say in this space is the risk component being clearly understood at all layers of the business is really important to be able to reduce a layer of that hierarchical structure of, when somebody reports a risk and then it goes to the next layer of management and the next layer of management, by the time it gets to the executive, it's quite filtered. What we need to do is reduce that filtering so that everybody's hearing the same message, and that the risks are understood in the context of the business units that they affect. And the reality is that safeguarding affects all business units. So if you're in finance, it affects you, because if you're receiving federal funding, within that funding arrangement, it states that you need to be compliant with the national principles. So therefore, you've got skin in the game. If we think about what it means for, governance and compliance associated to boards and executives, and a child, let's say if we think about a child who's been harmed in the course of their involvements with an early childcare provider, and that child then decides to self-harm and engages in, death by misadventure, then you're at risk of workplace manslaughter charges. So there's a whole range of things that we really need to be thinking about, that this isn't just a tiny piece of a puzzle to protect children from immediate harm. This is a much bigger piece to be able to protect children who have been harmed, and also protect organisations to understand their own risk profiles, to know where we need to be going, the only way to know that is to know where you've been, and not feeling, there's a bit of a culture sometimes in organisations where when bad things happen, we hide them and we just deal with who did the bad thing, and then we deal with that. Safeguarding is about looking at the culture of the organisation and how the culture of the organisation reduces the likelihood of the person that does the bad thing not actually gaining access to the organisation. That's the bit that we need to focus on. And the unfortunate thing around that is we're not great at investing in prevention because it's not immediate and we don't see the benefits of it straight away. So I think that in itself is an issue. The next thing I'd say is when we think about the proportionate and scalable introduction of safeguarding into an organisation, often what's really challenging, particularly for frontline staff, is that they don't write the policy. And that a lot of the time the policies aren't written for them. They're written to adhere to a compliance obligation and to manage a risk. Well, the risk is only managed if the person knows how to execute the policy. And often there's a big disconnect in there. So the way that we operate is we actually bring those service systems together, and a policy doesn't get endorsed or approved until it's been vetted by frontline, because there's no point having a policy if it can't be executed.
Absolutely. And often, as you're saying earlier, with that information that gets filtered to the top, that's sort of almost it is a cultural thing, because we always think the person at the top doesn't need to know everything. They just want these top 3 points and that it's resolved. Mm-hmm. Rather than the action past that is to, let's look, like you said, culturally. And that's that joining, as you're mentioning, between your people on the ground and your people in management to get that through. And that's where also, I suppose, get the systems in place.
Yeah.
Would make a big impact.
It's a huge impact. And I think what I'd say in relation to that is that in a lot of organisations that we've worked with, there are systems, but the systems are disconnected and they don't talk to each other. What we've found with multi-agency sites like early childhood providers is the systems don't create visibility to the risk, and the risk becomes disconnected. So it might be in the southeast, we have a really good risk profile. In the northwest, we have a really challenging risk profile, but the two don't talk to each other in order to be able to complement or identify thematic risk, which then provides a platform for the organisation to say, oh, actually, we need, this is a problem here, 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 and here. Maybe the issue is that we don't have a policy. And in the absence of a system, human beings will create a system in order to streamline a process with good intentions. And so I'll often talk to organisations about the intent versus impact. Safeguarding, unfortunately, at times can be a pointing the finger exercise of your business unit doesn't do this and we don't do that and that's not our job. And,
Yes.
The issue with that is that it's everybody's job, and it's become a bit of a cliche term. Child safety is everyone's responsibility and everybody says it. But the question that I ask organisations is, what does that actually mean and how do you live it? Because we can all say whatever we like. But when it comes down to being face-to-face with a regulator and they say to you, show me, that's when the wheels are going to start falling off, and that's what we've seen. So our biggest piece of advice to organisations, particularly with multi-agency sites, is to have centralised visibility of risks. And your kind of key areas around that is your human resource practices, your risk practices, your complaints and feedback practices, and your investigation practices. If you don't have centralised processes in relation to those 4 key areas, you lose visibility of risk and you increase risk to children, because perpetrators will look for those variables as a means to enable themselves to gain access to vulnerable people without visibility.
That's right. And it's not just having what you're talking about there is I hear what you're saying about having those processes meshed across, because it's not just having the process at head office. It's actually making sure from that single site that the information is easily fed back to head office and without too much impact on an educator, because once you add more to their role, the likelihood of them doing it reduces.
Absolutely. And they also become fatigued and don't actually see the subtleties of safeguarding risk. And so what we need to do is create streamlined processes. And I'll simplify it with an analogy, if you like.
Yes, that'd be great.
So um, we often use these phrases when we're talking to people who don't work in child serving organisations. So we talk about when you go to McDonald's, any McDonald's, you expect to be able to buy a Big Mac, a cheeseburger, a chips in the same standard size no matter where you go. You don't expect to be able to buy a bottle of wine or a 6-pack of can of Cokes or a bag of lollies, right? We don't expect that because that's not the service we provide. When organisations create centralised systems of operation, what we're doing is making the consumer, including the child, have visibility to getting the same service in every centre. And the issue that we have is that we don't see that in some early childhood centres because the centralised product isn't there. What that does is when you've got a family, and we think about children, we've got mothers groups or parents groups. We have small communities. So I live in a reasonably large community that's very, very small. So my kids don't get to walk anywhere without somebody seeing them and going, oh, hey, how are you? And then hearing about that later. So word of mouth is, 80% of our future, right? So when we think about this and a parent makes a complaint or raises a concern to provide feedback, and this is the response they get from you, Paula, and it's very lovely and it's trauma-informed and it's delivered with a strength-based and solution-focused outcome, fabulous. And that might be because the system you have in place actually supports you and guides you through that process. But let's say that I go to a little childcare centre down here at the corner of my street and I speak to somebody else and they don't have a centralised process and there's 3 or 4 centres, I could get a different response each time. And those responses are going to be based on that person's own lived experience. That's the danger. Because when we go back to our earlier points of we don't know who we're employing, we don't know where they've come from, we know their work ethic and their background based off their references, but when we don't ask behavioural-based questions around child's perception of that person at an interview stage, for an example, we're actually not getting a sense of who the person is and how they actually connect with children and families. And it's not as if we're going to be saying who's got a trauma history, because that wouldn't be right. But if we interview correctly, we can get an understanding of how open they are to feedback, how they see particular safeguarding issues by the questions that we put on the interview. What we see at the moment is standardised questions. Tell me what you can bring to the organisation. Are you aware of safeguarding? Yes, tell me about that. Describe for me a situation where you've had to deal with conflict. Those questions aren't robust enough to be able to determine somebody's suitability and what their history might be in terms of their ladder of inference and how they process things.
Can I ask you, is that something that Safeguarding Solutions helps organisations with, right to that interview process?
Yes, yeah. Right. So we provide safer recruitment strategies and advice. We provide risk consulting strategies and advice. So anything to do with safeguarding, really, we provide. We provide education and training around indicators of harm, responding to harm. So depending on your jurisdiction, where your organisation's placed, we do some work with international schools in other countries and talking about what this means for them and how it translates culturally. So we do those things. And the reason why we've zoned into that is because what we noticed was that, particularly in early childhood, they knew what needed to be done. The issue was, how do we execute this and make it relevant and relative for everyone? And that was the issue. And people were relying on particular skill sets rather than a minimum standard of practice.
Yes. Wow. There's a lot to unpack, isn't there?
Yes, so much.
We've just touched the tip of the iceberg, I feel.
Yeah, absolutely. We're still looking at the tops of the trees at the moment, not the roots.
Yeah, and look, I'm just going to go back to something, Jeanie. You mentioned earlier about a business with their risk assessment. Our standard risk assessment says, yes, it's a low risk or it's a high risk, whatever that is. You're not saying that that's no longer useful.
No.
Right, so that's still an important part of the business risk. Absolutely. What you're saying is we need to add more.
Yes, correct. So the business risk from an enterprise risk or an ISO principle, so for those in the risk world would understand that terminology, it talks about traditional risk methodology and scoring, which talks to the reputation of the business, the cost viability to the business, Everything is business centered, though. It's not centered around an individual risk. What safeguarding is, it's an add-on that sits beside it that says, okay, this is a low risk issue. So let's say you get a complaint and the complaint relates to concerns of a child demonstrating some sexualized behaviors, for an example.
Yep.
In terms of risk to the business, it's very low. So why would we invest in providing education, support, professional development opportunities to staff if it's a low risk? The reason why we do that is, one, there's a legal obligation now to provide those services, which is wonderful. But when we look at it from purely a safeguarding perspective, what we have to think about is, well, what's the root cause of this behaviour for this child? By virtue of you being a childcare provider, that becomes your responsibility to understand. The only way you understand that is by understanding vulnerability, situations, organisational culture, and the pattern and history of the child, all of which a traditional ISO risk model isn't going to tell you to look at. So this is where the two actually complement each other really well. This can also be really helpful in understanding your OH&S landscape a little bit better too, when we start to look at what are the people in our business telling us is wrong by the way that they behave, by the amount of sick days they have, and what does this mean for kids in terms of how the service gets delivered? Because if we've got lots and lots and lots of turnover, that has an impact on children. And it also increases access for perpetrators to infiltrate, because organisations become desperate for staff, and we maybe cut corners a little bit and we get referrals. And one of the biggest things I'd say is casual contracting of staff through agencies. Is the induction and onboarding of those staff could be a bit more robust. What I've seen is basically a policy sheet. This is where they are, tick, 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 tick. They sign the form and they're in there to work for the day. So there are a huge range of opportunities in terms of understanding how those risk profiles talk to each other. But I don't want anyone to take out of this conversation that traditional risk methodology doesn't have a place. It probably has an incredibly large place for the organisation. What we need to do is get more direct at looking at the impact of those risks to people themselves.
So really what we have is a risk assessment and an impact statement. Is that?
Yes, correct. Absolutely. Great way to put it.
So now with that, if I was an educator in a room and we talked about sexualised behaviours that the child's showing, but it's even more than that, is it? Could even be a child escaping.
Oh, absolutely.
I don't like the word escaping necessarily. Trying to get onto the other side where the grass is greener. There's so many issues about safeguarding, and do you find quite often, as soon as you mention that, everyone thinks it's about sexualised behaviours and abuse in that way, where it's actually bigger than that?
Absolutely. So this is, again, this is the cultural piece, and the cultural piece has actually been fed through media presentation, and through no fault of anybody really. When we think about the Royal Commission, and the Royal Commission's title was Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse. And so when you try to talk about safeguarding in a different context, where we talk about sexual abuse and say, absolutely, and I, basically just want to say at this point in time to thank all of the people that came forward through that Royal Commission to give us this landscape today. Without their voices, we probably still would be a long way from being able to ensure the safety of children. So big thanks to them. What I would say, though, is the way in which everything has been communicated since the Royal Commission, there's been a heavy weight placed on sexual abuse because it has the greatest impact, has a huge liability risk for organisations and the broader government. But what it's failed to do, I think, is basically to share the messaging that safeguarding is a risk for everyone. Just because you haven't had an allegation of sexual assault in your organisation doesn't mean that this doesn't apply to you. So what we recommend people do is do a root cause analysis over their complaints, whether they be children or adults, because the adult complaints tell a story in terms of baseline behaviour and cultural behaviour and attitude within an organisation, which is a risk to children. So if you've got people where you've got an influx of complaints associated to workplace bullying, what's the chances in that dynamic of a child actually saying, I don't feel safe, I don't feel comfortable, when they're watching the adult world play out in front of them. So I think it's really important for organisations to understand that just because you may not have had an allegation of sexual assault, one, doesn't mean that it hasn't happened, but two, safeguarding is more than sexual abuse. Safeguarding is about when you're looking at your OH&S profile and you're deciding where to put your swipey doors, we need to make sure that they are high enough that if you happen to leave your key on the ground, that a child can't pick up that key and swipe themselves out. This is where you see the intersections between safeguarding and OH&S. OH&S, we're looking at the business obligations associated to the staff, not necessarily historically have we been looking at what it looks like for kids. And so when we see children escaping, and again, I agree with you, Paula, I hate that term, but when we see children escaping, it's these things that are present that actually create those opportunities, as well as supervision, high workloads. And again, this is why when we're working with early childhood, we're saying the workload and the pressure of the environment is high enough without putting more on top of people. Any solution should be reducing pressure, not adding pressure. And this is where organisations have got stuck in that confused state of, well, how? You know, how do we make it easier when this is something else we have to do? And it's just because we're looking at it as something new and different, when in fact it slides beautifully into a number of other areas.
Yeah. And look, and this is an example, I know we're probably going over our time a little bit. Just an example, if I was an educator who was in a room and saw those behaviours, what should they do? What would be, because quite often it's about not knowing what to do at that point. Mm. We have all the processes past that, but right in that moment,
how to respond.
Yeah. Have we got enough time to answer that?
It's a big question. What I would say in a very quick summary, if you're looking at how to respond, it depends on what your legal obligations are in terms of what the regulators expect, whether it be law enforcement, a CEQA, whatever it may be. There's a minimum standard of expectation associated to response. That needs to be considered in whatever your standard operating procedures are. But just as a quick, if a child comes to you and shares with you a concern, just listen. Don't react. Don't be overly curious. Just listen. And you're listening to the point where they're getting to their organic end of that summary. And often little kids will say, that's all. Textbook like that. And then once that happens, you then have to assess what the information is that they've told you. If a child's told you that they're being harmed at home, whether it be physical, sexual or otherwise, you've got legal obligations as mandated reporters to report to wherever it needs to go. But support the child to the end. Don't just let them tell you the information and then you go off and do what you need to do. If you do need to go off and do what you need to do, make sure somebody's with them. So it's really important to be present, to not be jarred by it, and to be prepared. And I think one of the biggest things we face with early childhood is that the organisations and the staff are so time poor when it comes to practicing this stuff that when it happens, they get a little bit jarred. Or when I go back to thinking around desensitisation over time, we get used to it and we think, you know, familiarity. We're like, oh, yeah, we know what to do here, and we potentially compromise evidence. So it's really important that if that's an area that your organisation wants to know more about, that's certainly something that we can talk to you about. But it's a different threshold of intervention depending on what's being reported.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that. That's so simple and basically just listen. Yeah. And you know, like you said, the familiarity there and the desensitisation would almost make you just go, oh, yeah, that's okay, and not stop and think about the bigger picture of that child.
And don't dismiss illogical things. Kids come out with crazy things. And the one thing to remember is that as we grow up, we forget to speak child. We've stopped learning how to do that. We lose imagination, we lose innovation, and we stop connecting to the point where we understand what all their words mean. And that's not their job to learn to speak our language. It's our job to speak theirs. And I think, you know, when children say, you know, I'll give an example, you know, Dad put his wee-wee on my wee-wee. And immediately it was a report and the child's been sexually abused and whatever. And then when we went out and interviewed that child, they lived on a farm, they had tank water. Dad went and did a wee in the morning. They don't flush if it's a wee to preserve water, and the child has then gone to the toilet. So it can be that simple. And so it's really important to listen and be curious without compromising any evidence. And that's a skill that needs to be taught. So again, if people need that, that's something that we can provide, and that can be delivered in a 2-hour session. So it doesn't need to be anything over the top. But if you don't know, acknowledge that you don't know as a means not to reduce the future trajectory for this kid if they have been abused.
Because with that, the obligations we spoke about earlier, the legal obligations is right down to that nominated supervisor, right down to your educator, anyone
Absolutely.
in that workspace. And quite often, maybe someone doesn't understand what their obligations are or what could happen to them.
Yeah, exactly. And again, this talks to the regulatory standards tell you that you need to have an informed and skilled workforce. If we think about the Convention for the Rights of Children, they have a right to be afforded education in a safe environment. This isn't anything new. These things have always existed. The issue is that we haven't executed them, not necessarily because we don't want to, but we haven't understood what it means to execute it in the context of a 3, 4, 5-year-old child. So when you have a policy, the question that I would ask, if you've got a complaints policy, how does that complaints policy translate to a 5-year-old? How does a 5-year-old know how to raise a complaint within your services? And if
That's a
you
great
don't know
question.
the answer, then I would say that you probably don't have a mechanism for that. And again, that's something, if you want more information about, we can talk to you about. But it's, everything that's relevant to a child needs to be written in a way that they understand it, no matter how old the child is. If it's pictures, infographics, it has to happen. So this is where we're talking about, okay, yes, we're a child safe organisation. Show me how you are, because your words aren't going to meet the threshold of a regulator.
And it's the living it, like you said. Now,
Yes.
Now, for our last little bit, just I know we've been a great topic to talk about and get out there. If we had to break down safeguarding into a 5-point process of getting started, what would those 5 points be?
I would say know where you've been in order to know where you need to go. So visibility and awareness of risks can only be determined through root cause analysis. So if you haven't looked at your pattern and history of your organisation in terms of feedback and complaints, that's something you want to be doing. Out of that review, capturing themes to determine what has the potential to cause the greatest impact to a child or young person that not only harms them, but puts you in contravention or breach of being a fit and proper person or a registered organisation. Increase awareness and visibility through communication and reducing the presence of hierarchical structures. Hierarchical structures to children are intimidating, and they are also to staff. Staff should feel like they can walk in any door and talk to anyone about anything when it comes to safeguarding children. Because if the safeguarding concern relates to the line manager of which they're supposed to communicate it to, who are they supposed to talk to? And if your culture doesn't support that, that's a problem. 4, I would say we need to be taking a safeguarding lens to all corporate and operational policies, procedures, practice standards and frameworks. If we're looking at it purely from the corporate lens, we are not going to be creating safe environments for children. And lastly, I would say monitoring and modelling behaviours and ways of working from a quality improvement lens from the front. If we're not leading from the front, compliance and safety are going to be very short-lived. And anything that you do as an organisation associated to safeguarding must be measurable. It can't just be, yes, we do this, look at us, that's great, because, me am going to say, that's wonderful, good on you. Show me how you can demonstrate that other than your words. And if you can't, that's going to put you in a pickle.
Wow, that's fantastic, Jeanie. Those 5 points really sum it up. And effectively, if someone wants more, give you a call at Safeguarding Solutions.
Yeah, of course.
Now, this is just a really offbeat question here. What's the worst thing that a board member, an educator, nominated supervisor, if they failed, I suppose, in their duty of care because they didn't know, and they go, oh, well, I just didn't know that, or I didn't know how to do that. What are the ramifications?
Well, they can be plentiful. fortunately and unfortunately, I think fortunately so that it increases accountability, and unfortunately because sometimes people didn't know and it wasn't through intent. But
No.
we can't, it's like saying, I've had a really bad day at work, so I came home and I, killed my dog. But I was having a bad day and I didn't really know, what I was doing. That rationale is not going to fly anymore. There are greater expectations from regulators to comply. But the biggest things, I suppose, that can happen is workplace manslaughter charges in particular states. There are risks of failing to protect, which is a criminal offence. So you can, to sum it up really quickly, you could lose your house or go to jail. They're the two biggest things, the biggest risks to you as a person sitting on a board or sitting on an executive. And if we think about that in terms of holding directorship appointments, those risks become even greater for you individually. So, I would say that accidents hurt and safety doesn't. And think about safeguarding and other regulatory compliance obligations within your organisations as a self-managed insurance policy. If you have the control and the power to create safety in your organisations, if you invest in it. But if you don't, and you don't look after that self-managed insurance policy, you run the risk of a standardised insurer not actually giving you insurance. So we're getting to the point now where insurers are starting to look at their own liability and saying, this organisation doesn't have enough safeguarding threshold and measures in place, we're not going to insure them. So there's huge risks associated to, business safety and continuous service delivery. If you don't have insurance, you can't trade. So, it's really important to understand that that's a huge risk for businesses at the moment.
Wow. So, Jeanie, you just said accidents hurt, safety doesn't. I'm figuring that's your wise words for the day. Or do you have any others?
I'd say the one that sits closest to my heart is that every risk is an opportunity to turn somebody's pain into purpose. When people experience adversities in their lives, they feel like they're doing it on their own. And I think it's really important for organisations to look at risk and look at concerns, complaints and allegations of harm as an opportunity for that person's lived experience of adversity to mean something positive for other children and young people. And that's what I've dedicated my career to. And, I've been incredibly fortunate for that. But what we need to do is stop feeling fearful of risk and fearful of child abuse and get comfortable with the uncomfortable.
Oh, wow. Jeanie, look, I know we went a lot over time and I so appreciate your time here today and sharing that. And it's, we were looking forward to meeting Cassie as well, but might do that another time. And look, thank you very much again. Now, what we will do is share all of opportunity to be able to contact Jeanie at Safeguarding Solutions with our audience. And we look forward to Safeguarding Australia.
Excellent.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Paula.
Thank you,
so
Jeanie.
great to meet with you.
Same here. Now, just hold on a second. I'm just going to hit stop.